Let's just get in and out.
A break-in in a morgue. Something moved in the dark halls that shouldn't have. Officers raced through the cold, silent corridors, their hearts pounding with every step. And what they found left them questioning reality. In Nebraska, laughter echoes through an abandoned house, an empty, forgotten place. But that laughter, those whispers, they come from nowhere, leaving behind only a chilling drawing that seemed to appear out of thin air.
Unit 12, status check.
Copy. We're at the location now, approaching the front door. The property looks quiet, no visible signs of forced entry.
Then there was the old man in Oregon, his house filled with strange objects and shifting shadows. Something refused to let go, something that wanted to stay. An elk head, once just in decoration, seemingly watching with sinister intent. In the frozen woods of New Hampshire, a little girl appeared in the icy waters, standing there, her vacant eyes piercing the darkness. She was there for one moment, and then gone, without a trace, without a sound, just whispers carried by the wind. 4 stories, 4 encounters that defy explanation, that push the limits of what the living could face. Some things are meant to stay hidden. Some echoes refuse to fade. Welcome to Retraced Echoes. Today we dive deep into the eerie and unexplainable, exploring the paranormal through the eyes of those who are sworn to protect us. In this episode, we're unraveling tales of the supernatural as experienced by law enforcement officers, the men and the women who are trained to rely on facts and logic and reasoning. But what happens when they come face to face with things that defy all of that? Now, the stories we're going to be telling today is from the book True Ghost Stories. Real police ghost stories, true tales of the paranormal as told by cops and other law enforcement officials. Get ready to step into the unknown.
Our first story takes us to a lonely morgue on the outskirts of a quiet town, where 2 police officers respond to a break-in that defies explanation. In the shadows of the cold, sterile halls, something stirs, something that should have stayed at rest. This is the story of the Reanimated Woman.
It was an ordinary, quiet night in rural Illinois. The kind where nothing more than the occasional rowdy drunk or the overly ambitious driver would keep the police on their toes. The sky? It was deep ink black, devoid of moonlight. And the air, it had a strange, almost like weighted stillness, as if itself was holding its breath. Now, Officer Reynolds and his partner, Officer Maddox, they were patrolling the back roads, their conversation filled with small talk about the game last weekend. The boredom was almost comforting. Then, the call came in. It broke the night with a crackle over the radio, a suspected break-in at the local morgue. The dispatcher's voice carried an unusual edge, like even she could sense that this was something different. I mean, the morgue, it's an odd place to break into, Reynolds thought. After all, what could someone possibly want from a morgue, especially in the dead of night? Chemicals, perhaps, a curiosity that might draw a thrill seeker or an addict, but there was something that just didn't sit right. Something that gnawed at the back of his mind. When they pulled up, the building that loomed against the dark sky, an old structure with its red bricks weathered and chipping, paint flaking off the wooden trim, it stood silent, almost resentful of the intrusion. The custodian, he was waiting for them outside, and he was clearly anxious and panicked. As soon as he saw him, he rushed over, his face paled, his hands trembling despite the summer air. "I swear I saw someone," he insisted, his voice quivering, his eyes darting towards the building's doors. He looked like a man who had seen something that didn't quite make sense, something that just didn't sit right in the realm of normal. "Calm down, sir," Maddox said, placing his hand on the custodian's shoulder, trying to steady him. "What did you see exactly?" Custodian swallowed hard, as if trying to convince himself that he wasn't crazy. "I was mopping the hallway. Out the corner of my eye, I saw something. Someone, I swear it, a person moving fast like they were running. They disappeared right through the door, he said, pointing towards a dimly lit hallway that seemed to stretch endlessly into the bowels of the morgue. "You sure it wasn't a reflection? Maybe just your shadow," Reynolds asked, trying to inject some type of rationality into the eerie story. Custodian shook his head fiercely. No, it wasn't a shadow. I'm telling you, it was a person. I turned off the lights afterwards and locked myself out here until you arrived. I didn't want to go back inside by myself. Two officers, they would exchange glances. Could have been some kids messing around, maybe trying to scare the old man, or worse, could be someone desperate, a junkie looking for something to steal. Either way, they had to go check it out. They nodded to the custodian, drawing their flashlight and pushing open the heavy door, which groaned in protest as it swung inward. The air inside was cold, much colder than normal, almost unnaturally so. The silence just hung there, thick and oppressive, as if the place resented being disturbed. Reynolds felt the hair on the back of his neck prickle up, but he shook off the uneasy and chalked it up to just his imagination. After all, it was a morgue, a place meant for the dead. They moved cautiously down the central corridor, flashlights cutting through the darkness, beams playing across the walls and the floors. Their footsteps echoed, muffled yet unnervingly clear. The janitor's closet, the file room, the old offices. They found nothing. They continued, calling out to any would-be intruders to make themselves known. Only their voices answered, reverberating back from the darkened halls in distorted hollow echoes. Maddox was first to see her. "Hey, stop!" he shouted, the sound crackling like a whip in the dead of silence. Reynolds swung his flashlight around just in time to see a flicker of movement at the end of the hallway. A figure disappeared around the corner. It was a woman, her hair flowing behind her in a pale ghostly arc. Reynolds felt his pulse quicken as the adrenaline spiked. He ran, Maddox not very far behind. They rounded the corner, their lights darting ahead, cutting into the darkness, catching the movement of a door, just barely ajar. They rushed to it, finding themselves in front of a door, a label half worn away, reading "viewing room" in faded letters. Reynolds pressed an ear against the wood. It was silent. Not even the scuffle of movement. He swallowed. His mouth was suddenly dry. He reached for the handle, turned it, and found that it was locked from the inside. He pounded on it. "Ma'am, this is the police. Open the door now." No response. Just more silence. A deep, unnatural quiet that seemed to seep through the door and wrap itself around them. Maddox would glance back at Reynolds. Through unease, it was evident in his eyes. Something was wrong here. More than just a break-in. They had turned back to the custodian, who had very timidly followed them down the hall. "Can you lock this door?" Maddox asked. The custodian, he would nod his head yes. He would produce a key ring, and his fingers was fumbling across the various keys. At last, found the right one, and with a soft click, the lock turned. Reynolds would push the door open. A stale breeze of chilled air greeted them, slipping past as if trying to flee the room. They stepped inside, flashlights cutting through the very thick shadows. The room was empty, aside from a few gurneys against the far wall. Cold seemed to be so thick, pressing against their skin like an unwelcome touch. "There," Maddox said. His beam landed on a gurney in the middle of the room, draped with a sheet. Beneath it, a shape. It laid unmoving, body. Reynolds approached it cautiously, the stench of rot reaching him before he even touched the fabric. It wasn't the smell of something alive, no sweat, no fear, just the unmistakable odor of death. He hesitated, and then, in one swift motion, he pulled back the sheet. His breath caught in his throat. There, her skin a sickly gray, her eyes closed, and a tag dangling from her toe, lay the woman they had just been chasing. her long hair spilling across the gurney, her face eerily calm in the cold night. "Jesus," Maddox whispered. "How?" Reynolds, shaking his head, would take a step back, his pulse pounding in his ears. "See here." There was no answers, just questions that no one would ever believe. He turned towards Maddox, his voice coming out in a hushed breath. "Let's get out of here." Two officers backed out of the room, leaving the cold, silent figure behind, her pale hair still spilling across the steel as if she had never moved. As they stepped back into the hallway, the door swung shut, with a soft click behind them, sealing whatever darkness lurks within. Outside, the custodian stood in the parking lot, eyes wide, his face drawn. "Did you find her?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Reynolds glanced back at the building, shiver passing down his spine. He nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, his voice low. "Yeah, we found her." And as they drove away, the image of that lifeless body lingered in Reynolds' mind. The vacant stare, cold air, the impossible chase. He knew he'd never be able to explain what had happened in that morgue, and part of him didn't even want to try. There are things in this world, he realized, that simply refuse to stay buried. Things that wait in the dark, behind locked doors, till someone comes looking.
Our next tale unfolds in a forgotten town, in an abandoned house where silence reigns, until the echoes of a child's laughter ripple through the halls. Officer Daniels encounters more than just memories. He faces something that never left. This is the story of a childish haunting.
Now, the next tale comes from a rural town in Nebraska in the early 1990s. It was a time when the town had seen better days. The steady industry was dwindling. It was forcing families to move on and leave behind little segments of abandoned homes. The buildings, neglected and forgotten, became a canvas of decay, boarded up windows and peeling paint and the occasional broken glass glinting in the moonlight. Now, along these structures was a house that had been known to draw a little bit of trouble in the past, particularly from those interested in stripping its copper wiring. The police, they were familiar with it. They instructed to check the place whenever they'd make their rounds. In fact, there was one particular night. It was a very cold and snowy evening when Officer Daniels, working the lone patrol shift, he passed by the old structure. The house sat at the corner of an empty lot, allowing for a full view of its dilapidated exterior. It was quiet. The only sounds was that of the muffled crunch of snow under his tires and the faint sound of wind going through the surrounding trees. Daniels glanced at the building, his headlights illuminating the worn facade. Everything seemed to be as it should have been, boarded up and silent. A couple of hours later, during another sweep of the area, Daniels passed by the old house again, but this time, something was different. The back door was ajar, its dark frame cutting a strange angle against the whiteness of the snow. Daniel's pulse quickened. He knew that door was supposed to be closed. In fact, it was closed the last time he checked it. Instinct told him that somebody had broken in. Pulling over, Daniels would call in the situation, and he would try to keep his voice steady, regardless of how apprehensive he felt. He would climb out of his vehicle, the cold biting him through his uniform as he approached the building, his boots crunching through the freshly covered snow. And that's when he had a realization. You see, his footprints, they were the only one in the snow. The snow had been undisturbed, but he shook it off. Maybe the wind had blown away the tracks. He called in to request backup just in case and carefully approached the door, his flashlight cutting a sharp beam through the darkness inside. The house was decrepit. It was clear the time had not been kind to it. Everything from plaster that was crumbling off the walls, the floor that was scattered with debris, and the air that was thick with dust. The atmosphere was heavy. It was oppressive. Daniels called out, his voice echoing through the empty rooms.
Show yourself.
He took careful steps, making his way from the kitchen to the living room, sweeping his flashlight across every corner. But nothing moved. He was about to close and secure the door, chalking it up to just a false alarm, when a loud, sudden thump reverberated from the upstairs floor just right above him. Noise followed by the faint, unmistakable sound of children laughing. The laughter was hollow, distant, like a memory brought to life. It froze Daniels in his tracks for just a moment. He called out again, louder this time, but only the silence would answer him. He swallowed as he gripped his flashlight even tighter. Kids, he told himself. Has to be kids playing a prank. He's ready to find them and scare them enough to send them running. He moved towards the staircase, the wood creaking from the weight as he ascended the stairs. Each step seemed to grow a little bit louder, as if warning him to turn back. The laughter sounded again, closer now, but still without a source. A sound that shouldn't have been possible in an empty house. His heart, it was hammering his chest as he reached the landing. He paused and listened. A thump came from the bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was partially open and his flashlight beam barely cutting through the darkness within. He approached slowly, his breath catching with every creak of the floorboard. He would get to the door and he would nudge it with his foot. The hinges were squealing. The room was beyond empty, except for a few pieces of scattered furniture that was broken and a pile of old torn books with yellowed pages. But oddly enough, there was something on top of the pile, a piece of paper. Compared to the rest of everything, it was pretty pristine. It was almost like it was new. Daniels, he moved closer, crouching down, his flashlight illuminating what looked like a child's drawing. He picked it up. It depicted a stick figure in a uniform, much like his own. The crude drawing of the police officer stood alone, beneath what looked like a cloud, or possibly a shadow. As he would stand up, there it was again. The same laughter that he heard earlier, but this time it was right behind him, a sound too clear, too close. He spun around, his hand gripping his gun, the flashlight beam darting across the empty room, but there was nothing there. There was no one there. The air around him was suddenly colder, his breath visible in the dim light. Daniels would back out of the room, his instincts screaming that he had to leave, and he had to leave right now. He hurried down the stairs, his footsteps echoing, chased by the feeling that something was right behind him. The laughter was following, and then they faded into whispers that seemed to seep from the very walls. As he stepped outside into the cold night air, the door behind him would slowly creak shut. Daniels didn't look back. He radioed dispatch, his voice tight, telling them that it was just a false alarm. As he got into the car, his hands trembled slightly as he grabbed the wheel. As he would drive away, he would look up into the mirror just one last time. He would see the dark silhouette of the house against the snow, the back door now firmly closed, as though it had never been opened at all. He would never go back to that house again, and he made sure that no other officer did either. See, there's some places that he realized where the past, it never truly dies.
In a small town rich with history, some secrets are buried in old houses and old mines. Our third story takes us to a place where one man's memories linger far beyond his final breath. Officer Patterson soon learns that not everything leaves when the body does. We call this story Aswa.
In the 1980s, there was an old man that lived in an old Victorian-style townhouse that was built around the 1900s. He lived in the house since he was 2 years old, and many said that the house and he had become one. In a way, they both started kind of looking like each other. Both was graying and slowly wearing down with age. He's born around 1915, and he had seen many things change around the town. See, he wasn't a recluse. In fact, he had a semi-active social life. He was relatively well liked by his neighbors. Unfortunately, the old man was diagnosed with terminal cancer of the colon with just 6 months to live. The news hit the community relatively hard. It was drawing some sympathy from the lifelong residents. The man took the diagnosis with a grim acceptance, spending the remainder of his time making peace in his own ways. The night that everything changed, it was cold and clear, around 3 a.m. The police received a call from concerned neighbors explaining that she had not seen the old man come out of his house in the last couple of days, nor was there any lights visible from within. Fearing the worst, the dispatcher sent 2 officers to his house to check in on him. When they arrived, the streets were completely empty. The neighbors, they were awakened by the lights of the squad car as they peered behind drawn curtains, anxious and curious, realizing that what was probably about to happen was going to be forever. Some had tears welling up in their eyes. The officers approached the front door and knocked. The echo, it seemed like it lingered in the chilly air. After a few moments of silence, Officer Patterson turned the handle, and it opened very easily. An enormous elk head was mounted above the entryway. Its glassy, dark eyes. It was like it was watching their every step as they made their way into the house. Now the officers, they proceeded cautiously, their flashlights illuminating rooms filled with relics of a lifetime lived alone. They would eventually find the old man upstairs, laying peacefully beside his still-made bed, right on the floor, as though he was attempting to get into it, and he just fell a little bit short. His face was calm, a final surrender to the inevitable fate. They would check his pulse, but it was clear he had passed away some time ago. Patterson radioed into the dispatch, requesting an ambulance to come and retrieve the body. Now, this small town only had a couple of paramedics, and it only had 1 ambulance that was available, and it took about 30 minutes for them to arrive. The 2 officers, they waited in the downstairs parlor. The elk's eyes, it was almost like it was following them relentlessly. Now, when the paramedic arrived, he asked for help to get the body downstairs. Patterson and his partner, Officer Riley, they hoisted the old man onto the stretcher, maneuvering carefully around the narrow hallways and the creaky stairs. As they began to descend down the stairway, Patterson noticed something very odd. The elk's head, which had been facing forward when they entered, now seemed to have shifted its position slightly, as though it had turned. Beneath it, written in dark red, almost like it was fresh paint, was a single word: Aswa. Patterson felt a cold chill run through his body. See, he knew this word. It was Finnish, a remnant of his own heritage. It meant stay or remain. He glanced at Riley, but his partner, he didn't even notice the change. His focus was solely on the task at hand. Patterson cautiously reached out and swiped at the writing. His fingers came away wet, and to his horror, he realized it was blood. The officers exchanged a look. The apprehension was now turned to fear. "We need to get this done and leave," Patterson muttered. The paramedic nodded in agreement, his face pale. They moved the body out the door into the cold night air and towards an awaiting ambulance. As Patterson stepped out into the porch, something caught his attention. Every light in the house suddenly turned on, flooding the windows with an unnatural, blinding brightness. Simultaneously, a deep, low rumble began to echo from the very walls, growing louder, like the growl of some ancient beast being awoken. Patterson's heart raced. Riley shouted something, but it was drowned out by the deafening noise. The officers opened the back of the ambulance, and just as they managed to load the stretcher, every single window in the house simultaneously imploded, shards of glass bursting inwards, and then the entire front porch collapsed. The house itself seemed to sag, groaning, almost like it was exhaling its final breath. Dust filled the air and the street was plunged into darkness once more, leaving only the flickering lights of the ambulance. Patterson scrambled to his feet, coughing as he tried to locate Riley and the paramedic. He found them around the side of the house, shaking but uninjured, their eyes wide with terror. He's not, the paramedic said, pointing towards the stretcher. Patterson's gaze followed the trembling finger, and what he saw would stay with him for the rest of his life. The body bag, it was torn open, and it was empty. The old man, or what had been of him, was sitting upright on the ground, his mouth twisted in a grotesque, soundless scream. Patterson didn't even think, he acted. He grabbed a tarp from the back of the ambulance and threw it over the body, covering it. With his hands trembling, he would look at Riley, who had been turned away, his face pale as death. No one spoke. They all knew that this was something beyond their understanding. Eventually, another ambulance arrived to help, and the old man's body was taken away, but none of them could shake the feeling that the house, or something in it, had refused to let go and refused to allow the old man to leave in peace. The incident became somewhat of local legend, whispered by the townspeople. The house, it was left untouched, a grim monument to the strange, terrifying night. No one dared to enter, and over time, the word Aswa, it faded from memory. But the sense of unease, it remained, lingering in the air like a ghostly presence that refused to be forgotten.
Our final story brings us to a frozen lake deep in the forests of New Hampshire. There a little girl waits, or so they say. But when officers arrive, they find that some mysteries go deeper than the water itself. Be careful where you look, and beware of the girl in the water.
It was a freezing cold November night in New Hampshire out in the old countryside. Now you have to understand, out here is significantly different than the cold that you'll find in the city. If anyone is unprepared and they face it, well, let's just say it's a deadly combination. Many have perished over the years when they underestimate the deadly power of the winter's breath. Now the police, they received a call about a little girl that was wandering around the lake. A frantic voice proclaimed to have seen her, lost and dressed in only a white nightgown, despite how biting cold it was outside. Now this was a serious problem considering the weather. It was dangerously frigid. And with a child alone near the water, well, it would be easy for them to fall in and drown or possibly freeze before anyone could ever find her. The lakes around those parts, they're deep and they're dark. Their waters are very deceptive. Once something sank beneath the inky surface, it was unlikely to ever see the light of day again. Now, every officer that was available responded to the call. 2 officers, both fathers, who felt an extra pull. Parental urgency, knowing that the clock was ticking against this unforgivable cold. Now, after a long drive through the empty, dark roads, they finally reached the lake. Now, snow, it had been falling for several days, leaving the landscape draped in white. It swallowed all sound. The air seemed thick, heavy with the kind of silence that only winter can bring, and a natural hush that left only the sounds of their breath and the crunch of the snow beneath their feet. They would eventually call into dispatch and let them know that they was there, and they decided to split up for a little while just to cover a little bit more ground, and they did. They looked for what seemed like forever out in the bitter cold. Now, the tough part of areas like this is you have to remember there's marshy areas. Eventually, they would find themselves at a very small beach, clearing where the lake kind of opened up a little bit. The wind, it was moving across the waters, causing very small ripples across the surface. Where could she be? Officer Holloway would mutter to himself. He would eventually catch up with his partner, Officer Brooks, who was busy scanning the tree line. They would check and hollowed out logs. They was looking for footprints, anything that might indicate where the child might be. Then They were just about to finish up with their regroup when Brooks would nudge Holloway, gesturing silently towards the water. Holloway turned his flashlight in that direction, and his breath caught in his throat. There she was, standing in the shallow ankle deep of the dark freezing water, a little girl, her hair hanging down, tangled and wet, wearing nothing but a thin white nightgown that clung to her small frame. The beam of the flashlight caught her eyes, and for a moment, they seemed almost reflective, empty like glass marbles. Hey, sweetheart," Holloway called out, stepping cautiously towards her, holding one hand out. "It's okay, we're here to help. Come out of the water, all right?" But she didn't move. She just stood there, staring at them. Her lips was blue, her eyes vacant, eyes that didn't seem to register them at all. Holloway would glance over at Brooks. A feeling of unease settled in his bones. See, something wasn't right. "I'm a police officer, honey. It's not safe out here," he tried again, his voice softer, almost like it was pleading. He kneeled at the water's edge, his arms outreached, beckoning her to come to him, just like he would his own daughter. The girl then moved. She took a step forward and then another, the water rippling around her legs as she made her way towards him. Brooks breathed out in relief, his heart pounding. She was almost within reach, her small frame illuminated by the beams of their flashlights, when suddenly she was gone. Not a sound, not a splash, just gone, like she had never been there at all. Holloway and Brooks exchanged a stunning look, and before either could react, they heard it. Soft laughter echoing across the lake, distant and chilling. The two men turned in unison, their flashlights sweeping the water, catching nothing but the undisturbed surface, black and glassy. More officers arrived shortly thereafter. Having heard the commotion over the radio, they searched for hours, climbing the shore, calling out from the woods, shining their lights across the water, but there was no trace of the girl. It was as though she simply vanished into the night. 2 years later, another report came in, a different officer, different winter night, and again, a girl in a white nightgown standing in the lake. This time, too, she vanished before they reached her, leaving behind nothing but footprints in the mud and the haunting echoes of a distant laugh. The locals speak of her now in a hushed tone. The girl in the water. A lost soul, they say, unable to leave, bound to the lake by some terrible fate. What she wants, why she appears, no one knows, but those who have seen her say that they will never forget the emptiness of her eyes or the way that she simply disappears, as if the lake itself swallows her whole. Well, hopefully y'all enjoyed these 4 stories that was found inside the book. I'm going to leave it down in the description down below. There's still plenty of stories left in the book, so if you want to hear more, tell me in the comments down below. I'd die to know what your thoughts are on some of these stories. Do you think they're legit? Which ones do you think is probably the most legit of the 4? I don't know. Again, these are from cops that's supposed to protect and serve. They're the ones that I consider the most trustworthy. But hopefully y'all enjoyed it. Until I see you on the next podcast, goodbye.